Tom Holcomb graduated from Gallaudet University with a BA in psychology. He worked there at Gallaudet for a short time, and then he came here, worked here at RIT. He pursued his master's in career and human resource. He continued his studies, pursuing his PhD at the University of Rochester. Tom, we have many students from the University of Rochester with us here today. Can you raise your hands? He got his PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of Rochester. He currently works at Ohlone College in Fremont, California. Tom is a professor as well as one of 2 interim deans for the Deaf Studies Division there. Now, without further ado, Tom. Thank you, Gene. Hello, everyone. I'm always thrilled to be back to Rochester, specifically at NTID. I spent 9 years of my life here working from 1982 through 1991. Presenting in this room has a special meaning for me because this room is named after Ellie. Ellie was a person who recruited me to RIT. At that time, I was a 22-year-old kid, recently graduating from Gallaudet, and this was my first real job. Ellie saw something in me, apparently, that young kid. She hired me, she gave me my first chance, she served as my mentor, my support. She was my everything. I miss you and love you, Ellie. This room is very special to me. Also, I'd like to thank NTID for helping shape who I am. I graduated from Gallaudet, which is a very special place, but I started my professional career here at NTID. This book would not have been possible without the support of Mark Marshark. Mark Marshark, where are you? There you are. Thanks to Mark, this was a 10-year endeavor. I had many starts and stops during the course of that time, and Mark came to me and said, do it. Oxford will accept your work. So I got serious and we got it published. So thank you, Mark, for that push to complete this book. Thank you so, so much. I must admit, this book's title is rather boring. Introduction to American Deaf Culture. Boring. The book itself is not boring. It's a good book. I can boast about that. You may wonder, why a boring title? Well, the book is to serve as a textbook for classroom instruction. In the past, I noticed that most college books, whether we're talking about Intro to Psychology, Basic Philosophy 101, or Biology 101, all have boring titles. And they don't want to be construed as anything else. And so I wanted people to see this as a textbook. So therefore, I came up with a boring textbook type of title. We did not have a real textbook on American deaf culture. There were books about deaf culture, about the deaf experience, and in using those materials for instruction, I had to piecemeal my curriculum. So this book satisfied my personal need for a solid textbook, and hopefully others will find it useful in their classroom as well, and that's great. Let me share with you how all this started. I've been teaching for 30 years. In putting together the classroom material, I had to pick and choose from a variety of books out there. I felt it was time to come up with one solid resource for the classroom. There were books out there that talked about deaf people, but not real deaf people's lives. They did not. It was on the education of the deaf, professional careers of the deaf. What was needed was a book about real deaf people's lives. There were a few books out there, but not many. And I wanted a book that reflected real deaf people's lives. People of contemporary times. Many deaf culture books talked about deaf people in the past. Things have changed. For better or for worse, regardless, things have changed. And in looking at many deaf culture books, it talked about my parents' time, my grandparents' era, my youth, not about modern times. And I wanted something to reflect today's day and age of what deaf people's lives are like. And that was the goal behind this book. My first job was at Gallaudet. I served as a recruiter, touting the merits of Gallaudet, downplaying NTID, making sure that Gallaudet was seen as the better choice among the schools. And then I happened to be offered a job here. I remember my first summer, a student approached me and said, "Oh, I thought you said that Gallaudet was a better school." Well, I said, "I'm here." My point is that I had the opportunity to visit many schools for the deaf all across the nation. And it was an aha moment for me. Many deaf people had different experiences than what I grew up knowing. Schools for the deaf, enrollments were shrinking. Mainstreaming was becoming more common. And then when I came to NTID, I even had a bigger wow moment. I realized that deaf people here didn't sign. They spoke orally. However, the biggest bombshell was they were here of all places. Why was that? These were really bright deaf people, mainstream, successful stories, and they came to RIT. In other words, they were very successful. Right, they could have gone to any university, basically, yet they chose to come here, meaning they were looking for something. And what is that something? To me, that was deaf culture. But what is that? And so through my studies and research, I've come up with some propositions. My first job was basically to resolve issues in the dorm. I worked on the student life team here at NTID. I was summoned often to go to the dorms to resolve issues between our hearing and deaf students. Hearing students often claimed the deaf students are so rude, and the deaf students would make the same claim against the hearing students. I found myself in the middle. I'd ask the deaf students, "Are you trying to be rude?" And they said, "No, the hearing students should know better." Meaning there was something fundamentally different between the two groups, and that was a difference of culture. One great example to illustrate this was once I led a workshop. This one hearing student exclaimed how rude and disrespectful the deaf students were. When asked what he meant, the student stated that deaf people make terrible noises in the shower. The hearing student went on to point out, "And it's that deaf student who happens to be at this workshop." I thought, noises in the shower? What have I gotten myself into here? The hearing student said that the deaf student repeatedly blew his nose in the shower. And he happened to be in the next stall when that happened. He found the sound disgusting. When asked, the deaf student stated that there was nothing wrong with this behavior since the shower curtain was closed. At that moment, I understood something. Since no one could see the deaf student with the curtain drawn, he assumed he had complete privacy. If the curtains were open, he would not have blown his nose since he would assume no such privacy. I realized that hearing people have a different worldview where one has no expectation of privacy until there is no sound, whereas from the deaf student's point of view, no one has privacy until one is out of sight. Realizing this, I began to investigate and write about this dynamic. RIT was the perfect laboratory for these deaf-hearing relations. At Gallaudet, being in the majority can dismiss hearing people's values. And anywhere else in the world, the hearing majority can do the same to deaf people. But here at RIT, there is a critical mass of deaf people. Both hearing and deaf people can claim a space of their own. As a result, a lot happens here between the two worlds. This is a fabulous place. Next, I went on to work at Ohlone College, where they have 150 deaf students enrolled. I teach 3 different deaf culture classes. One is exclusively for hearing students. I tell them what deaf culture is about. I say so. The tests are based on my idea of what deaf culture is. I teach a deaf section to deaf students, separate from hearing students. I would not tell them what deaf culture is. That's not my business. They are deaf just like me, so I help them process their experiences of deaf people. We have discussions what deaf culture is. I give them the language to express themselves better. We discuss the issue of signing exact English. Should that be banned? Are cochlear implants awful or not? I don't tell them how they should think. We have discussions, and often we come to a consensus. Many deaf students need to process their experience. Many of my students harbor anger about their parents not signing, about being mainstreamed, whatever the issue is. They need a safe place to have these discussions, to process and come to a resolution of their issues, of their unfinished business. The third section I teach is to deaf students who are not college material. I teach at a local community college. The students are not that literate enough to get into school, but they still deserve the same opportunity. These are non-transferred credit classes, whereas the other 2 are credited classes. So that's what's contained within my book. Deaf people often say, deaf culture is extinct. It's old news. It's old-fashioned. The reason they say that is that deaf people have been fully assimilated into the broader society. Segregation has been outlawed. Discrimination is illegal. We have the ADA, the IDEA, 504, which means we can go to any school of our choosing. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you can attend your home school district with appropriate services. You can go to any college or university that you qualify for. Nothing is stopping us. What do we need schools for the deaf for? What do we need Gallaudet for? What do we need NTID for? Really? Tell me. We have captioning on our television sets. We don't need clubs for the deaf. We can stay home, sit back and watch TV all night long. Previously, deaf clubs were a necessity for socializing and watching captioned films, but today those are unnecessary. We also can call anyone now. We can order a pizza, call a friend, a neighbor, a boss, whoever we choose. The world is at our fingertips, and that is so cool. We don't need to rely on a small circle of friends anymore. Smartphones are available now. We can text back and forth to our hearing friends. It's so easy. Oh, and best of all, we have cochlear implants, so we can become hearing. We have the cure. It's there. That's what many people think. People say deaf culture is extinct. Most books on deaf culture identify residential schools as the heart of the deaf community, the schools for the deaf. What percentage of deaf students attend schools for the deaf this day and age? Maybe 20%, if we're lucky. More like 15%. Most deaf people have no residential school experience at all. And then they talk about the deaf clubs, how important they are. They're closing down left and right. Well, Rochester still has a club for the deaf here, but across the nation, they are closing. In my home, San Francisco, there used to be 2 clubs for the deaf owned by members, and they both have closed and been sold. They talk about American Sign Language being the key. Most deaf people I meet this day and age sign with exaggerated mouth movements. Is that American Sign Language? My grandmother would be turning in her grave. So, most deaf culture books identify those 3 hallmarks as keys to American deaf culture, and that bothers me because, again, a lot of deaf people are here at NTID. They are here. Yes, signing with exaggerated mouth movements, no residential school experience, but they're here. They're in search of something. What is that something? It must be deaf culture, but it's much more than what's up here. Now let's step back and put aside the discussion on the deaf experience. There are many problems in today's world caused by the oppression of people. We see this all across the earth when a culture, a country, or a group of people are oppressed and suffering results. When colonialism occurred, someone else makes decisions for you, where your community or culture is seen as less than the oppressors. And there's the need for basic human dignity. It's a basic need. People need to be respected, regardless of the color of skin, what religion they find themselves in, whatever their community is. And oftentimes, they want to know what's wrong with them. Why aren't they being respected? Why are you destroying my language, my culture? Is it because I'm seen as primitive? And that's a constant struggle all across the world. Not just deaf people, but that's happening worldwide. And communication is so significant. Language and culture are intertwined. Language develops because a group of people in a geographical region have that need. For whoever lives in that region, language develops. It's a simple concept. Language is not invented by a committee. It's invented by people who live in a certain community. The vocabulary, the thinking reflects the community's needs. A famous example, some people say it's somewhat exaggerated, but I like this example. In Alaska, there are countless words for the concept of snow. And in Africa, they may have one word for snow because that reflects the daily lives of the people living in that region. It's about communication, communicating in a way that fits the community's need. And deaf people have that same need. One of the biggest frustrations by people being oppressed is that others make decisions for them. They come to their land and say, this is the way it should be. Think about the Native American Indians, where white people decided their way of life was no good and made drastic changes. We all are familiar with what the results were of that. That people are still suffering in similar ways. Policies, decisions are made by non-deaf people. Still, to this day and age, decisions are made by people who have no business making these decisions in the first place. And finally, everyone has a basic human need to feel good about themselves. Whether you're a woman, a person of color, a member of a religious community, trying to fit within the broader context of the community. So for a deaf person, this means that you're not going to be able to change who you are. Why waste your life struggling and feeling ashamed about who you are? The best solution is just to be proud of who you are. And deaf culture serves that purpose. Black culture serves that purpose for Black people. Be proud of who you are. It's a basic human right, basic human need. It's rather simple, and deaf people are no different. We just are human beings like everyone else. And lastly, and one of my favorite arguments for having deaf culture is to discuss the solutions they provide. We've all seen a myriad of definitions of what culture refers to: clothing, religion, language, and this is my favorite. Culture gives us access to solutions that have been proposed by people who preceded you. Our problem is nothing new. Our challenges in life are nothing new. Why reinvent the wheel again and again and again? People in the past have gone through the same challenges and have come up with solutions and have passed them down from generation to generation so that our lives are so much easier. When we're born, we don't have to think about what is right and what is not right, what is proper, what is improper. We have been taught based on solutions that have come from people preceding us, and we are indebted to them. Thank you so much. And deaf people are no different. When a child comes into the world and they're deaf, it's not the first deaf baby on earth. And the parents' reaction, it's not like they're the first parents having to deal with a deaf child. And they act like they're the first parents dealing with a deaf baby. Come on. Deaf people have been dealing with hearing parents who are ignorant, who make bad decisions for years. And we have come up with solutions to deal with the stupidity of people around us. The solutions have allowed us to live a good life in spite of hearing people. No offense, but it's so true. In spite of hearing people, we manage to live productive lives. We have our own culture that is so good that many of us want our children to have similar experiences. They often say, you have a deaf child, you are so fortunate, you are so lucky. Everything else you read, whether you're talking about special ed, the disability community, oftentimes identify deafness as one of the worst disabilities on earth. It's so true. They always rank first or second as deafness being the worst debilitating disability out there. So unfortunate, so sad. Whereas deaf people say, I hope my child is born deaf. What? And I applaud deaf people for finding solutions to us not being able to hear and to still live a productive life. I cannot understand why parents don't want that, don't want those solutions out there. They're ready-made, but they deny them. There's something wrong with this picture. My book takes a different lens on deaf culture, something more basic, but something more real and more powerful, a more powerful description of deaf culture. And I hope that you like it. Before I proceed, I want to clarify something about my book. I don't want this book to be an endpoint, be considered the Bible of American deaf culture. It's this way because Tom said so. Instead, I hope that you use this book as a kickoff point, as a starting point for your discussion. If you have different ideas, different thoughts, that's great. Let's talk, because we have so much more to learn. My experiences in California may be different than your situation here. Our ages are different, or different generations. Who knows? So please present this book as a starting point for your discussions. Or you have a better way of describing culture? I'd like to hear it. Please share. First, I call this the gift to the deaf community, to people who are recently diagnosed as deaf, and that is that you are okay. The residential schools served an important role for a deaf person who first encountered other deaf people at the school and realized that, oh, I'm okay. I'm okay. There's no more doctors having to prod my ears, giving me speech lessons. Well, we still have speech lessons, but you spend time in the dorm at the schools of deaf. The kids didn't care whether you could speak or not. They didn't care about that. They looked at you and they judged you based on your personality, on your relationships with others, like anyone else. Everyone deserves that, to be judged for who they are, not because I can speak or not, I can hear or not. That's ridiculous. But that's the story of our lives growing up. My worth was measured by my speech, by my audiogram. So within the deaf community, there's more to you than whether you can hear or speak. And that's the gift from deaf people, and it's needed. The residential schools are no longer out there. So where do you get such support? Places like here, NTID. The students come here and they question, am I okay? In my deaf culture classes, I'm often asked, am I okay? They want to be validated. They want to be approved of, not measured by their hearing, but just for who they are. And that's a basic human need. Deaf culture provides that. Deaf culture is also very strong in allowing us self-determination. The Gallaudet protest is a good example of that. The deaf community is another good example of that. We'll talk more about that in a minute. We also share a great deal of information. Hearing people generally do not. The reason we share so much is that information is hard to come by. Most parents don't sign. Most teachers don't sign well enough or are not allowed to sign. With hearing aids, you get partial information. And many deaf people's English fluency is limited. They struggle with English vocabulary. And as a result, they rely on the deaf community to share information on medical conditions, one's experiences, situation. Sharing happens a great deal. It can be seen as gossiping. And previously, I did think maybe we did gossip a lot as part of our culture, but I've changed my thinking. I now realize it is our responsibility to share with each other, period. That is the solution that we have come up with. I have a simple example. If you're talking about someone in a cafeteria and there's a woman who is not very pleasant and there's someone who knows how to fingerspell, you share that information so that when you go to that same cafeteria, you avoid the grouchy person and you go to the friendly person to get service. Is that gossiping? No, it's not. That is helpful information to avoid an unpleasant experience. And that is important. And hearing people are way too polite and proper. Deaf people don't want to be so proper. They'd rather have information shared directly. If you're talking about the cafeteria situation, you may refer to the woman, the woman with the big wart on her nose, avoid her. go to that long-haired woman. She's a better server. Is that important? A hearing person may say, well, avoid Sally and just go be served by Bill. They get there, hearing person can look and say, okay, avoid Sally, there's Bill. Go to the right person. A deaf person with that same information may go, who can I ask? Who is Sally? Who is Bill? The more information I had before, the less awkward it is once I get there. And it's an important responsibility that we all share information with each other to make our lives easier down the road. So information sharing is an important piece of the culture, even though people will deny it. Someone may say, well, that person's less educated. They talk too much. They gossip, and I don't. But then they'll proceed to share a lot of information on their own. Full access to communication is another key part. And for me, that means American Sign Language, ASL. But it's more about wanting the information to be presented clearly, very clearly, visually, whether it's captioning, sign language interpreters. That's our struggle, to have full access to communication, whether it's home, school, or the workplace, to have full access. The solution is American Sign Language for many of us. Deaf people typically reject the label of being called disabled. I'm not disabled. I'm normal. I'm just fine. And in my book, I discuss this. This is a very difficult chapter that I wrote because I must admit that I also try to reject the disabled label, that it makes me look bad. But now I realize that is the wrong attitude to have. The wrong attitude. Simply wrong. We must fight for the dignity of everyone. Everyone. Also, hearing people look at us as disabled, period. So the question is, why are we so adamant against that label? And it's because of our solution. We grew up being seen as disabled, needing a fix here and there, that something was wrong with us. But we now realize that within the culture, we don't need a fix, and therefore we're not disabled. With that understanding, people understand where I'm coming from. The challenge for us, though, is to look at our own attitudes about the other disabled people in the community. They deserve respect and dignity just like we do. And that's hard for me, too, to understand that. But it's part of my growth to understand the world better. Now let me talk about self-determination. Deaf people have a long history of self-determination, starting with the first school for the deaf in America. It was established by a partnership between a deaf person and a hearing person. We had Thomas Gallaudet and Laurent Clerc come together. And for me, that's a very touching story. It's part of my history, deaf and hearing people working together. And in the world, many of the schools for the deaf were established because of hearing people having pity for deaf people, trying to help deaf people. But the American model has been one of deaf and hearing people working together from the very beginning. Hold that value. There are about 10 charter schools that have been established across the nation. You see, before, the schools for the deaf were not deaf-centered. Most residential schools did not respect the deaf agenda of those 4 basic values. They did not. They simply did not. Deaf people have given up on those places and established their own charter schools. All 10 charter schools are bilingual, meaning American Sign Language and English are giving the same support. Hearing and deaf people are working together collaboratively, and that's part of the history that continues to this day. The Deaf President Now movement. We all are too familiar with that. Many organizations for the deaf were established in America because of the need for self-determination. We took care of ourselves. For example, the NFSD, the National Fraternal Society of the Deaf. That was an insurance company established in 1901. It was established because deaf people could not purchase life insurance. The reason being is that insurance companies saw deaf people as a risk, that they died early, young, because of their disability, because of their sickness. And so insurance companies felt it was a losing proposition to sell insurance to deaf people because of their early death. Deaf people were not willing to accept that they could not have insurance to support their family. Deaf people decided to take things into their own hands and say, forget the insurance companies. And they established their own insurance company, the NFSD. We take care of our own. It's not about hating hearing people. It's about protecting our culture, our community. It's that simple. That is our legacy. And also, clubs for the deaf served a really important role for many years. It was a refuge for deaf people. You work out in the hearing world, you spend time with the hearing families, you come to your deaf clubs, and you have a moment of relaxation. They built their own clubs, all by and for deaf people. Many deaf clubs were paid off, did not carry a mortgage. That lasted for many, many years until recently with the demise of the deaf clubs. And they did that because it was a way of serving ourselves, self-determination. Just recently, we're seeing more and more retirement communities for the deaf being built. Enough of hearing people, really, enough of poor communication, enough of the same old, same old. At the end of one's life, you want to have people that you can communicate with. I also introduced this concept. All cultures have rules. What is proper, what is not. For example, being direct. They say that deaf people aren't very polite because they're so direct. Oh, really? Yes, deaf people are blunt. That's true. But to be called impolite, I question that. In the past, I did feel that way, but I've changed my mind. For example, I am a divorced man. Annually, maybe once, possibly twice a year, I would be asked, why did you get divorced? Because you seem like such a nice man. And it's been 14 years since I've gotten divorced, and not one hearing person has ever asked me why I got divorced. Is that part of deaf culture? Once or twice a year, I'm asked. Most deaf people don't ask me that question. But on that one or two occasion, I would be asked, and I would think, well, that person isn't well educated. But I've changed my thinking on that. It's about information sharing. When a person asks me that question, probably in the back of their mind, they're thinking, well, my parents got divorced years ago. And they told me that they got divorced because Daddy and me were fighting all the time, and we didn't love each other anymore. And that's all they got. And so they were probably wondering why they got divorced, whereas their hearing siblings knew that things weren't going well, that there was loud arguments. But the deaf person did not have much information. I guess they argued and they got divorced. And so by asking me, they were probably wanting to know why their parents got divorced. It's more about their parents than about me. The first time I was asked, I replied, it's none of your business, but I've changed on this. Now I will share, well, a marriage is hard. Whether you're looking at a husband and wife, They were raised different ways, and they come together and they have to compromise constantly. And sometimes it's difficult. For example, maybe one's a big spender, the other one's quite frugal. Who's right and who's wrong? Well, maybe somebody's a clean freak and the other person is sort of lax on their cleanliness. Somebody likes to go to bed at 10 o'clock, whereas the other person likes to stay up all night and watch TV. Right or wrong, it happens. And the person may reply, well, thank you for helping me understand why my parents got divorced, because I never knew why my parents got divorced. Again, that's information sharing. They want to know who they can ask to get information. It's not being direct, blunt, or mean. It's just desiring information. Once or two times a year, I was asked, also the idea of explicit rules. In some cultures, rules are written, policies, laws, the Constitution. In American culture, we can see it through our own Constitution, the right to bear arms, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. We see those rules. Other countries have their own set of rules, and they're explicit, they're documented. Whereas implicit rules means it's just understood. There's no written law. For example, if you go to a restaurant, you pay a 15% tip. Well, now it's 18%. We know that. You won't go to jail if you don't pay the tip. But it's well understood, to be polite, you pay the tip. Next, we have the emblematic rules. Maybe it's not rules that we understand, but it's within a certain community that it's well understood. For example, when I was in Japan, I was asked if I owned a gun. I said, no, I didn't. Whereas the person says, well, everyone in America owns a gun. And I shared with them that I knew no one who owned a gun. Whereas the Japanese person said, everyone in America owns a gun. Now, we all know that we can have a gun, and some people are very proud gun owners. But it doesn't mean that all Americans own guns. But it's very linked to American culture. You watch the movies and media, it's all about having a gun. That's an icon of our culture. Same with the question of me being divorced. That's an emblematic rule. Most of us don't ask about divorce, but when you're asked, it will be by a deaf person. It will be. Okay, I'm running short of time. But this helps answer the question of who's a member of the culture. People will deny it over and over again. It's those few over there. This helps answer that question, who's a member of the culture. Only if they accept and exhibit these behaviors. The deaf community is extremely vibrant. I have a couple of examples to share with you. They're listed in my book. One is being the Rochester community. The other is Fremont, California deaf community. Let me explain why I identified these two communities. Fremont, where I am from, has a very active, strong deaf community. Incredibly so. Its anchors include a deaf club, all established by California School for the Deaf students. There's a long history of brilliant leaders coming from that school. Today, most of the leaders came from mainstream programs, which is not true historically. The schools for the deaf provided those leaders. And as a result, history has provided these leaders who have established organizations and services for the deaf community. For example, the president of the Deaf Club is from a mainstream school, and that's no problem. But historically, the leaders came from the School for the Deaf. Here in Rochester, it's very different. Rochester has a very vibrant deaf community, countless organizations. Who established all these organizations were formal students who were raised orally. Many of them, they came to NTID, they did not sign, they tried to speak for themselves, but gradually they became members of the community, the culture. They even established their own baseball team for deaf players. They set up churches for the deaf where they didn't want interpreters. They wanted a church of their own. These are leaders who were mainstream and raised orally, but they found themselves here. There was something here, and it wasn't the residential school or deaf culture as we traditionally had known it. It's more of self-determination and deaf identity, whereas Fremont was the historical anchor. NTID in Rochester is more the contemporary example. Many of your organizations here at Rochester are relatively new, but they both are anchors, and I find them both very fascinating. They meet the basic human need. There's very little difference between the two. In closing, I'd like to talk about my last chapter in the book, and that has to do with the future of the deaf community. We find ourselves in very interesting times right now. I propose 3 possible scenarios for the future. Interesting enough, all 3 are occurring right now as we speak. Who will be the winner? What will the final outcome look like? We don't know. The first possible scenario is that the deaf community will thrive, especially compared to my youth and my parents' time. That we have it so good right now. We have video relay service, captioning, 24/7. ASL is being taught everywhere. Hearing students are being taught ASL. It's a wonderful time to be deaf. We have it good. And the future looks even brighter. Being deaf will be even more accepted. Our country is becoming more diverse. And so being deaf and using American Sign Language will be just another foreign language. We will be respected and embraced as a deaf community and not seen as less than. We have wonderful services at our disposal. And that's happening right now, and the future looks even brighter. At the same time, we have the cure for deafness getting closer and closer and closer. The government is spending millions and millions of dollars in the advancement of the cochlear implants, in the study of genetic codes. Research is happening. So within our lifetime, what does that mean for us? It's coming closer and closer, and every generation is seeing more medical interventions proposed. The fix is not there yet, but will it be there one day? Who knows? Will we have fixes for visual impairments and hearing impairments? Will the deaf gene be discovered and eliminated? Millions and millions of dollars are being spent on these projects. Could we be the last deaf people on Earth? Good or bad, that's up for debate. The third possible scenario is that the deaf community is changing. What we currently have will not be the same down the road. Look at the residential schools for the deaf. Most schools for the deaf today do not serve the regular deaf student with no additional disabilities. Most of the schools serve those deaf students with severe disabilities, including blindness, emotionally disturbed. Your average deaf person will be mainstreamed. And with the cure being out there, most deaf babies are a result of premature births or mothers who are addicted to drugs, and they come with severe health problems. And that's happening currently. Most of the schools of the deaf are serving students of that sort. Is that the future of the broader deaf community? Well, we'll have the fix for your typical deaf person, and so you'll have less of those. That's happening right now. And so I close with that thought. What does the future hold for us? All three scenarios are happening right now, but nobody knows the future. So basically, that's what my book is about. The lives of deaf people in contemporary times. And my belief that the deaf culture is as strong and vibrant as it ever has been, but in a different form, much different. Still strong and vibrant. Thank you so much for your time.